Welcome. We hope the very best comes your way. Let us know your thoughts on our latest story. And don't forget to tell us which city you're watching from. Subscribe so you never miss a meaningful story every day. Chapter 1. The Lost One. The dense forests of Evergreen Ridge, Montana, were a world of their own, ancient pines towering over the land, mist weaving through the valleys at dawn, and creatures moving unseen in the undergrowth. It was a place of both beauty and brutality, where survival was a delicate balance. Claire Dawson had learned that balance well. A wildlife photographer and conservationist, she had spent years tracking elusive animals, capturing images that told stories of life in the wild. At 31, she preferred the quiet solitude of nature over the chaos of city life, finding comfort in the unpredictable rhythm of the wilderness. That morning, she had set out before sunrise, camera slung across her shoulder, hoping to photograph a rare herd of elk that had been spotted along the riverbanks. The crisp mountain air filled her lungs as she moved carefully through the forest, stepping over roots and damp leaves. But then, a sound stopped her in her tracks. A faint, trembling cry. Claire stilled, her pulse quickening. It was unmistakably feline, but too weak to belong to a full-grown predator. A mountain lion cub? A stray house cat? That didn't seem likely. Not this deep into the wilderness. Heart pounding, she moved toward the sound, parting the dense ferns, and then she saw it. A tiny bobcat cub, barely old enough to be away from his mother, lay curled beneath a fallen log. His fur, once sleek and spotted, was now damp and tangled. His sides rose and fell in uneven breaths, each one a struggle, but what struck Claire the most was his eyes, a deep amber, full of fear and pain. Her breath hitched. This wasn't right. Bobcat mothers never left their young alone for long. Something must have happened. Claire scanned the area, her trained eyes catching the subtle signs of a struggle: disturbed soil, broken branches, the unmistakable marks of claw and tooth. It looked like a fight had taken place, but whatever had attacked had vanished. The cub gave a weak, pitiful mew, barely lifting his head. His frail body trembled from exhaustion and cold. Claire knelt beside him, carefully reaching out. She had been in the field long enough to know that interfering with wildlife was never a decision to be taken lightly. But if she left him here, he wouldn't survive the night. A soft gust of wind rustled through the trees, carrying the distant rumble of thunder. The storm was moving in fast. Making her choice, Claire shrugged off her fleece jacket, wrapping it gently around the cub. He didn't resist. He was too weak to fight. "You're safe now," she whispered, cradling his fragile form against her chest. She didn't waste another second. The nearest wildlife rehabilitation center was over an hour away, and the roads were already turning slick. If she didn't move fast, it would be too late. As she ran toward her jeep, the cub let out a small, shaky exhale, his tiny body pressing closer to her warmth. In that moment, Claire had no idea that saving him would change both of their lives forever. Chapter 2. A Fragile Bond. The storm had rolled in faster than Claire expected, turning the mountain roads into a treacherous maze of slick mud and shifting gravel. She kept a tight grip on the steering wheel of her Jeep, barely able to see through the downpour. The wipers struggled against the torrent, but Claire's focus was on something far more fragile than the storm: the tiny bobcat cub wrapped in her jacket on the passenger seat. She risked another glance at him. His small body barely moved with each shallow breath, his spotted fur still damp from the cold. He had stopped making any sounds a while ago, and that terrified her. "Just hold on a little longer," she murmured, tightening her grip on the wheel. The Evergreen Wildlife Rehabilitation Center was still a good 40 minutes away, and every second counted. She had called ahead, reaching Dr. Ethan Lawson, the lead wildlife specialist at the center, who assured her they'd be ready when she arrived. Ethan. She had worked with him before, their paths crossing on several conservation projects. He was brilliant but infuriating, always insisting that nature should take its course, even when it meant letting animals die rather than intervening. Claire understood his perspective, most of the time. But not this time. Not when this tiny creature had no one else. The rain came down harder, hammering against the Jeep's roof as she finally turned onto the highway, pushing the vehicle as fast as she dared. She didn't care about the storm, didn't care that she was soaked to the bone, didn't care that her muscles ached from carrying the cub. All that mattered was getting him help. When she finally pulled into the sanctuary's gravel driveway, the sky was nearly black, the storm raging in full force. She barely put the Jeep in park before shoving open the door. Ethan was already waiting, his tall frame illuminated by the porch light. He hurried toward her, eyes narrowing as he took in her soaked clothes, her desperate expression, and, most importantly, the small bundle in her arms. "He's in bad shape," Claire said, her voice tight with emotion. "Inside, now." Ethan led her through the entrance of the clinic, where warmth and the scent of antiseptic and damp fur filled the air. He motioned toward the examination table, and Claire carefully placed the cub down. Unwrapping her jacket, the cub let out a weak, almost inaudible whimper, his body barely stirring. Claire's stomach twisted at the sound. Ethan moved with precision, his years of experience evident as he examined the cub. "Male," he muttered, gently running his hands along the small body. 4, maybe 5 weeks old, dehydrated, malnourished. He gently flexed one of the cub's hind legs. "Looks like a sprain, not a break, but he's dangerously weak." Claire watched, every muscle in her body tensed with anticipation. "Can you save him?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he placed a stethoscope against the cub's fragile chest, listening for far too long. Then, finally, he exhaled. "He's got a chance," he admitted, "but it won't be easy." The weight on Claire's chest lifted slightly, though she knew nothing was guaranteed. For the next hour, she stood at the edge of the room, watching helplessly as Ethan and his team worked. They inserted an IV line, administering fluids to combat dehydration. They checked vitals, massaged warmth back into the cub's small limbs, and applied ointment to the cut near his paw. Claire could do nothing but watch. And wait. It wasn't until Ethan finally stepped back, rolling his shoulders, that Claire allowed herself to breathe. "He's stable for now," Ethan said, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck. "The next 24 hours are crucial. If he makes it through the night, we'll have a better idea of his odds." Claire nodded, her hands still curled into fists at her sides. "What now?" Ethan gave her a pointed look. "Now, you go home." Claire bristled instantly. "Excuse me? We can handle it from here," he said, wiping down the examination table. "This is what we do." "Claire, I want to stay." Ethan sighed. "Claire, I found him," she interrupted, her voice firm. "I didn't just drop him off and move on. Ethan, I want to see this through." For a moment, Ethan just stared at her, that unreadable expression he always wore when he was thinking too much. Then, finally, he exhaled. "Fine," he muttered, walking toward a cabinet. He grabbed a clean towel and tossed it to her. "But at least dry off. You're dripping all over my clinic." A small, unexpected smile tugged at Claire's lips as she caught the towel. For the next few hours, Claire sat in the corner of the room, refusing to leave. Every few minutes, she would glance at the cub, watching for any signs of improvement. He remained curled up in a makeshift incubator, his small body rising and falling in slow, uneven breaths. Ethan had pulled a worn notebook from his desk, jotting down notes about the cub's condition. Claire watched him from the corner of her eye, surprised by how gentle he was when he worked. For all his stubbornness about letting nature run its course, he cared deeply. She wasn't sure how long she had been watching when Ethan suddenly spoke. "You got a name for him?" Claire blinked, caught off guard. "A name?" Ethan shrugged. "Some of the team likes naming rescues. Gives them a bit of a fighting spirit." She looked at the small cub, still barely clinging to life. She thought of how alone he must have felt in the woods, how close he had been to death. And then, the name came to her. "Luca," she whispered. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Luca?" Claire nodded. "It means light, and right now, he needs all the light he can get." Ethan was silent for a moment before finally giving a small nod. "Luca it is." The hours passed slowly, but somehow, the night didn't seem as heavy anymore. Claire remained by Luca's side, hoping, praying, that she had done enough. At some point, exhaustion began to weigh on her, and she drifted off into a restless sleep, curled up in the clinic chair. When she woke, the first rays of morning spilled through the windows. The storm had passed, the sky was clear, and then, she heard it, a soft, raspy chirp. Her eyes snapped open as she turned toward the incubator. Luca was awake, his golden eyes, dazed, weak, but full of determination, stared right at her. A slow, Disbelieving smile spread across Claire's lips. He made it, she breathed. Ethan, still groggy from sleep, rubbed his eyes before looking at Luca. Huh, he muttered. Guess the little guy's tougher than he looks. Claire reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against the glass of the incubator. Luca lifted his tiny head. And for the first time since she had found him, he chirped again, louder this time. It was weak, but it was there. Claire's heart swelled with relief. Against all odds, he had survived the night. But now came the real test, preparing Luca for the wild. Where he truly belonged. Chapter 3. A Wild Heart. Claire hadn't expected to grow so attached to Luca. At first, it had just been about making sure he survived. She had found him half-starved, barely clinging to life, and had fought desperately to give him a chance. That was all it was supposed to be, a rescue. A temporary effort, but as the days passed, as she watched him regain his strength, she realized she had crossed a line she hadn't meant to. She cared about him, more than she should. It had been a week since she had brought Luca to Evergreen Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. And already, he was transforming before her eyes. His once frail frame was filling out, his spotted coat growing shinier, healthier. His small, rounded ears twitched at every sound, and his golden eyes, once dulled with exhaustion, now gleamed with newfound energy. But he wasn't a pet. She had to remind herself of that. Ethan had made that clear from the start. He can't get used to people, Ethan told her one afternoon as they watched Luca from the observation window. The cub was batting at a small piece of fur-covered training prey. Testing his instincts. We're trying to keep human interaction to a minimum. If he starts depending on us, he won't survive in the wild. Claire nodded, but she hated the thought of keeping her distance. Every part of her wanted to comfort Luca, to be the constant presence he had never had. You've been here a lot, Ethan noted, his voice unreadable. Claire turned to him, folding her arms. Yeah, so? Ethan studied her. Are you sure you're ready to let him go? Claire's heart clenched, but she forced a casual shrug. That's the whole point of this, isn't it? Ethan didn't press, but something in his expression told her he wasn't convinced. Over the next few days, Claire tried to do what she knew was best, creating space between herself and Luca. She watched from a distance as the team introduced more survival challenges. They hid his food to encourage hunting behaviors. They brought in controlled live prey, a mouse, then a rabbit, to test his instincts. Luca hesitated at first, but then something clicked. Claire watched as his body lowered into a crouch, his muscles taut with anticipation. His eyes locked onto his target, and in a flash, he pounced, swift, precise, almost silent. It was his first successful hunt. Claire should have felt proud. Instead, she felt a strange ache in her chest. Every instinct she had screamed that she should be happy. Luca was learning to survive. He was becoming what he was always meant to be, wild. Untamed, independent, but a selfish part of her hated it. She had been the one to save him. She had been the one to stay up all night, waiting for him to open his eyes. And soon, he would be gone. Ethan must have noticed the shift in her mood, because later that evening, he sat beside her on the sanctuary's back porch, offering her a mug of coffee. You look like someone stole your favorite hiking boots, he said dryly. Claire let out a short, humorless laugh. Funny. Ethan took a sip of his own coffee, studying her over the rim of his mug. This isn't easy, he admitted, even for me. You think I don't get attached? I do, every damn time, but we have to remember what's best for them. Claire gritted her teeth, staring at the ground. I know, she exhaled sharply. He looks at me like he knows me, like he trusts me. Ethan was silent for a moment before he spoke again, his voice softer than usual. That's the hardest part, Claire. They trust us to do right by them, even when it means letting them go. She hated that he was right. Still, she spent that night restless, staring up at the ceiling in the small cabin she had been staying in near the sanctuary. A few hours before dawn, a soft noise woke her. A chirping sound, small, almost questioning. Claire's heart stopped. She sat up slowly, listening. The sound came again. Sliding out of bed, she padded to the window, pushing aside the curtain. Luca was sitting just beyond the fence line of his enclosure, golden eyes fixed on her window. Her breath caught. He had found her. A mix of emotions tangled inside her. He shouldn't be here. He shouldn't be looking for her. But at the same time, the sight of him, His small form silhouetted against the moonlit sanctuary grounds, filled her with a terrible longing. "Luca," she whispered. For several moments, neither of them moved. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, Luca turned and slipped back into the shadows, vanishing like a ghost. Claire pressed a hand to her chest, trying to calm the wild beating of her heart. She knew what she had to do. The bond between them was real. But if Luca was going to have a real chance at survival, she had to be the one to break it. The next morning, she made a painful decision. "I need to step back," she told Ethan. Ethan, to his credit, didn't look smug. He simply nodded. "I think that's the right call." Claire swallowed the lump in her throat. "You'll handle the rest of his training?" "I will." Claire clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stay composed. "Good." Ethan watched her carefully, his green eyes thoughtful. "You don't have to disappear, Claire, but you do need to make peace with this." She nodded stiffly, not trusting herself to say anything more. Later that evening, she stood at the fence of Luca's enclosure one last time. He watched her from a distance, his ears pricked forward, his golden eyes full of something she couldn't quite name. Claire took a deep breath. And then, she turned and walked away. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Luca needed to forget her. And she needed to let him go. Chapter 4. The Call of the Wild. Claire stayed away. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. But she forced herself to keep her distance. No more watching from the observation window. No more late-night visits to Luca's enclosure. No more letting him find her. Ethan had taken over his training. As promised, he sent her occasional updates. But she never asked for them. Each time she saw his name pop up on her phone, she hesitated before reading the messages. Luca took down his first live rabbit today. Quick, clean, instincts are kicking in. We introduced him to a larger enclosure. He's adapting well, getting stronger. He's almost ready. Claire knew that last update had been coming, but it still hit her like a punch to the gut. She thought she had prepared herself for this. She had been wrong. One afternoon, as she sat outside her cabin, staring blankly at her untouched cup of coffee, Ethan appeared at the edge of the porch. He didn't say anything right away, just leaned against the wooden railing, studying her. "We picked a release site for Luca," he finally said. Claire's fingers tightened around her mug. "When?" Ethan hesitated. "Tomorrow morning." She nodded, swallowing past the knot in her throat. "Tomorrow." It felt so final. "Do you want to be there?" Ethan asked. Claire exhaled slowly. Did she? Could she? She had told herself that stepping back had been for the best. That if she saw Luca now, it would only make things harder for both of them. But she couldn't let him go without saying goodbye. The next morning, Claire arrived at the sanctuary before sunrise. A thin mist clung to the trees. The world still wrapped in the quiet hush of early dawn. Luca was waiting. Ethan and the other rehabilitators had already secured him in a transport crate. A sturdy metal carrier designed for releasing animals back into the wild. Claire approached slowly. Luca's golden eyes locked onto hers. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then he let out a low, familiar chirp, one that made her chest ache. "He still remembers you," Ethan murmured. Claire forced a smile. "I didn't think he'd forget so easily." The drive to the release site was silent. Claire sat in the back of the truck with Luca's crate, her fingers resting lightly against the cool metal bars. She didn't try to reach inside, didn't let herself touch him. She just sat there, listening to his steady breathing, committing it to memory. They arrived at a remote stretch of protected forest land, far from human settlements but rich in prey and shelter. The perfect place for a young bobcat to start fresh. Ethan and another rehabilitator carefully unloaded the crate, setting it down in a clearing surrounded by thick undergrowth. "This is it," Ethan said, glancing at Claire. "Are you ready?" "No." But she nodded anyway. Ethan unlatched the crate. For a long moment, Luca didn't move. He stayed crouched inside, his ears pricked, his golden eyes scanning the forest ahead. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, his paws touching wild earth for the first time since Claire had found him. She held her breath. Luca sniffed the air, his tail twitched, his muscles tensed. And then, he was gone. He didn't look back, didn't hesitate. One moment he was there, and the next, he had melted into the undergrowth, vanishing into the wilderness where he truly belonged. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire let out a slow, shaky breath, feeling something inside her splinter apart. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked. She nodded. "Yeah, but she wasn't. She wouldn't be. Not for a long time." Luca was free. That was what mattered. But as Claire stood there, staring at the spot where he had disappeared, she couldn't shake the feeling that a piece of her had gone with him. Would Luca truly thrive in the wild? Or would their paths cross again in an unexpected way? Find out in the final chapter. Chapter 5. The Bond That Never Breaks. The days turned colder as autumn set in. The leaves had shifted from their vibrant greens to fiery reds and deep oranges, blanketing the sanctuary grounds in a sea of color. The air smelled of damp earth, wood smoke, and the first whispers of approaching winter. Claire busied herself with her work, focusing on the new rescues that arrived at the sanctuary. She spent hours tending to injured foxes, rehabilitating owls with damaged wings, and helping an abandoned coyote pup adjust to its surroundings. But no matter how busy she kept herself, Luca was always there, in her thoughts, in the quiet moments of the evening when the world fell still, and in the dreams that came unbidden in the dead of night. It had been months since she'd last seen him, since that day in the clearing when he'd vanished into the forest, taking a part of her heart with him. Ethan had noticed her quiet sadness. "You ever think about looking for him?" he asked one evening as they finished up inventory in the main office. Claire gave him a small, tired smile. "He's where he's meant to be." Ethan leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "And if he's not?" She shook her head. "Luca's wild. He belongs out there. I had to let him go." Ethan studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Yeah, but that doesn't mean he let go of you." She didn't know what to say to that. But then, one crisp morning, the past came rushing back to her in a way she never expected. It started with a phone call. A local farmer, an older man named Joe Hartley, had called the sanctuary about a young bobcat hanging around his property. "He's not causing any trouble," Joe said over the phone. "Just watching, hanging around the tree line like he's looking for something." Claire's breath caught. She knew. It couldn't be. But every part of her screamed that it was. Without hesitation, she grabbed her jacket and keys. "I need to go." Ethan was already pulling on his boots. "I'm coming with you." The drive to the ranch felt endless. The narrow road wound through dense trees, sunlight filtering through the branches in golden slants. Claire's heart pounded with every mile. Could it really be him? When they arrived, Joe met them near the barn, his weathered face lined with curiosity. "I saw him early this morning, near the fence over there," he said, pointing toward the edge of his property. "Didn't come too close, just sat there watching." Claire barely heard him. Her eyes had already locked on something at the tree line. A flash of golden eyes. A flicker of movement in the autumn shadows. She took a slow step forward. Luca. He was bigger now, stronger, his coat sleek and thick from months in the wild. He moved like a predator, powerful and graceful, but his eyes hadn't changed. They still held recognition. Claire dropped to her knees, keeping herself low, non-threatening. "Luca," she whispered. He didn't run. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then, slowly, cautiously, Luca took a step forward. Then another, and another. Claire's chest tightened as he came closer, his movements deliberate. Then, he pressed his head against her knee. A soft chirp escaped him, a sound she hadn't heard in months, a sound she never thought she'd hear again. Claire's hands trembled as she ran her fingers through his fur. "You came back," she whispered. Ethan let out a quiet breath behind her. "Guess you were right. He does belong out there." Claire nodded, brushing a hand over Luca's ears. "Yeah, but he still remembers where home is." But she knew she couldn't keep him. Luca was wild, and no matter how much it hurt, she had to do right by him. She stayed with him for hours that day, sitting in the grass while he curled up beside her like he had when he was small. She spoke to him softly, telling him about everything he'd missed. Ethan sat nearby, silent but watchful. As the afternoon light faded into gold, Claire knew what she had to do. She stood up. Luca's ears twitched. She took a step back. His body tensed. Another step. He let out a small, uncertain chirp. Claire swallowed against the lump in her throat. "Go," she whispered. "You're free." Luca hesitated for only a second. Then, in one fluid motion, he turned and slipped into the forest. This time, Claire didn't watch him go. She turned, walking away before the sight of him disappearing could break her again. Because now, She knew the truth. He would always find his way back.